Hey everyone, before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so YouTube keeps sending you more spine-chilling stories like these. I knew something was wrong the moment the driver didn't ask for my destination. Even though the app hadn't updated on my phone yet, it was one of those humid, sticky nights where the air feels like a wet blanket, and all I wanted was to get home after a 12-hour shift at the hospital. I climbed into the back of the silver sedan, the interior smelling faintly of stale cigarettes and a heavy, cheap air freshener that seemed designed to mask something more metallic and unpleasant. "Hey, I'm headed to West 14th Street, I said, leaning forward to catch his eye in the rearview mirror, but he didn't acknowledge me at all. He just pulled away from the curb with a sudden jerk that sent my bag sliding across the cracked leather seat. I watched the digital map on my phone, waiting for the blue to sync up with our movement, but instead of heading toward the highway, the driver took an immediate left into an alleyway that I knew for a fact was a dead end for through traffic. "Wait, why are we turning here? The main road is much faster at this time of night," I said, my voice rising just a little bit as the first prickle of genuine fear started to crawl up the back of my neck. He remained silent, his hands gripped so tightly on the steering wheel that his knuckles were white under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. I reached for the door handle, thinking I would just jump out while he was moving slowly, but my fingers met nothing but a smooth, plastic hole where the lever should have been. He had stripped the interior door panels, and I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that I wasn't just in a bad ride. I was in a cage. I tried the other side, throwing my weight against the left passenger door, but it was the same story there. The handle was gone, and the window crank had been snapped off at the base, leaving nothing but a jagged metal stub that I couldn't possibly turn with my bare hands. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I felt the car begin to accelerate as we exited the alley and entered a part of the shipping district that was completely deserted after midnight. Why wasn't he saying anything? Why hadn't he looked at me once since I stepped into this rolling coffin? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my hands from shaking as I reached into my pocket for my phone, but as soon as the screen lit up the cabin, the driver slammed on the brakes. The force of the stop threw me forward, my forehead smacking against the back of his headrest, and before I could recover, he reached through the gap between the seats and swiped the phone right out of my hand. He didn't even look back as he tossed it out his own window and into a storm drain we were passing. The sound of my only lifeline hitting the water was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. "Give me my phone back! What are you doing?" I screamed, lunging forward to grab his shoulder, but he was wearing a thick, heavy leather jacket that I couldn't get a grip on. He swiped at me with a backhand motion, his heavy ring catching me across the cheek and sending me reeling back into the seat. The car started moving again, faster this time, weaving through the darkened warehouses where no one would hear me scream even if I had the lungs of an opera singer. I looked at the back of his head, noticing for the first time how thick and scarred his neck was, and I realized that this wasn't a crime of opportunity. This car had been modified specifically for this purpose. The child locks weren't just engaged. The entire mechanism for escape had been surgically removed from the passenger compartment. I started to wonder how many other people had sat exactly where I was sitting, feeling that same cold realization that they were never going home. He turned onto a gravel road that led toward the old pier, a place where the streetlights had been shot out years ago and the only witnesses were the rats and the rising tide. I knew that if he stopped the car and got out to come around to my door, it would be the end of my life. I had to do something while the car was still in motion, while he was occupied with the act of driving. I began to feel around the floorboards, hoping for anything. A forgotten tool, a heavy bottle, even a loose coin, but the floor was unnervingly clean. Then, my foot brushed against something hidden under the driver's seat. I reached down, my fingers trembling so much I could barely coordinate them, and I felt the cold, hard shape of a heavy-duty tire iron. He must have kept it there for protection, never imagining that his prey would be the one to find it. I didn't pull it out immediately. I knew I only had one chance, and if I missed or if I only grazed him, he would overpower me in seconds. I waited, watching the silhouette of the pier get closer and closer, the black water of the harbor shimmering like oil in the distance. The driver slowed down as he approached a rusted gate, reaching out to punch a code into a keypad. This was it. I gripped the tire iron with both hands, ignored the throbbing pain in my face, and lunged forward into the gap between the front seats. I didn't aim for his head. I was afraid the headrest would block the blow. Instead, I jammed the heavy metal bar into the steering wheel and the gear shift, putting every ounce of my weight into a desperate lever action. The car bucked and groaned as the gears ground together with a horrific screeching sound. The steering wheel jerked violently to the right, and the driver let out a guttural roar of surprise as he lost control. We slammed into a stack of empty wooden pallets, the impact jolting my entire body, but the momentum was enough to stall the engine. The driver was dazed, his head having hit the side window, and I didn't waste a single second. I didn't try the doors again. I turned onto my back, pulled my knees to my chest, and kicked at the rear windshield with everything I had. On the first kick, nothing happened. On the second, a web of cracks appeared in the safety glass. On the third, the entire pane shattered outward in a spray of glittering diamonds. I scrambled through the jagged opening, the broken glass slicing into my palms and my jeans, but I didn't feel the pain because the adrenaline was a deafening roar in my ears. I hit the gravel hard, rolled once, and scrambled to my feet just as I heard the driver's door creak open behind me. I didn't look back. I ran toward the maze of shipping containers, my breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. I could hear his heavy boots crunching on the gravel behind me, his breathing just as heavy as mine, but I was smaller and faster. I dove between two massive blue containers, pressing my back against the cold metal and holding my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to explode. I heard him pass by, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the corrugated steel. He was muttering to himself, a low, rhythmic chanting that made my skin crawl. I waited until the sound of his footsteps faded toward the water, and then I ran in the opposite direction, toward the distant glow of the city skyline. I ran for what felt like miles until I saw the blue and red lights of a patrol car parked outside a 24-hour diner. I didn't stop until I was pounding on their window, sobbing and bleeding, trying to explain that the man in the silver sedan was still out there at the pier. When the police finally went down there, they found the car abandoned, but what they found inside the trunk was enough to make the lead detective vomit. There were trophies, bags, wallets, and hair clips belonging to 6 different women who had gone missing over the last year. They never caught the driver that night, but they found his DNA all over the tire iron I had used to save my life. I still don't take taxis anymore, and every time I hear the sound of a car door locking, I have to remind myself to breathe, because I know just how easy it is for a ride home to turn into a ride to the end of the world. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the neon signs of the city into long, bleeding streaks of light against the pavement. I had been standing under a leaky awning for 20 minutes before a yellow cab finally pulled up, its available sign flickering like a dying candle. I didn't even check the driver's ID in the window. I just dived into the back seat, grateful to be out of the cold, and gave him my address in the suburbs. He didn't nod or say a word. He just shifted the car into gear and merged into the light midnight traffic, his movements smooth and practiced like a professional chauffeur. For the first 10 minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal, and I felt my muscles finally start to relax as the heater began to blow warm air around my damp clothes. But then, we reached the turnoff for the main expressway, and instead of merging onto the ramp that would take us toward my neighborhood, the driver accelerated straight ahead into the industrial district. I leaned forward, thinking he might have just missed the exit due to the poor visibility of the storm. "Excuse me, I think you missed the turn for the I-95, I said, tapping lightly on the plastic partition that separated us. He didn't respond, but I noticed his eyes shift to the rearview mirror, locking onto mine for just a split second with an expression that was cold and completely devoid of emotion. He reached up and flipped a switch on his dashboard, and suddenly the digital GPS screen on the dash went black, plunging the front of the car into shadows. I pulled out my own phone to check the route, but as I looked down, I realized I had no signal, which was impossible for this part of the city. I looked up and saw a small, black device suction-topped to the corner of the windshield, a signal jammer that was humming with a low-frequency buzz I hadn't noticed before. My heart skipped a beat as the car suddenly veered off the paved road and onto a service path that ran alongside the train tracks, a place where no taxi would ever have a reason to go. Then the driver picked up a handheld radio, not the standard police or taxi dispatch kind, but a sleek, military-style unit. He keyed the mic and spoke in a low, gravelly voice that sent a shiver of pure ice down my spine. "This is Unit 4. I have the package secured. I'm transitioning to the secondary extraction point now. Ensure the back entrance is clear and tell the cleaners to get the plastic ready." The word package echoed in my head, and I realized with a sickening thud in my stomach that he was talking about me. This wasn't a random robbery. This was a coordinated abduction. I grabbed the door handle and pulled, but it was deadlocked from the front console, and the heavy-duty partition meant I couldn't even reach him to fight for the wheel. I was trapped in a moving vault, being delivered to a destination where cleaners were already waiting for my arrival. "Who are you? Who is paying you to do this?" I shouted, kicking at the back of his seat with all my strength, but the seat was reinforced with a metal plate that didn't even budge. He ignored me, turning the radio back on to receive a burst of static-filled confirmation from the other end. "Copy that, 4. The buyer is on site. Don't be late." The car began to slow down as we approached a cluster of rusted warehouses that looked like they hadn't seen a human soul in decades. The driver began to put on a pair of black tactical gloves, flexing his fingers as he maneuvered the car toward a large, rolling bay door that was slowly beginning to rise. I knew that once that door closed behind us, I would disappear from the face of the earth, and no one would ever find so much as a fingernail of mine in this concrete wasteland. I looked around the back seat frantically, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon or a tool. My eyes fell on the seatbelt buckle. I realized that the metal tongue of the buckle was sharp and made of hardened steel. I pulled the middle seatbelt all the way out until it locked, and then I began to saw at the fabric of the belt with a small pocket knife I kept on my keychain for opening boxes at work. The fabric was thick, and my hands were shaking so hard I nearly cut myself, but the fear of what was waiting behind that warehouse door gave me a burst of frantic energy. Just as the cars had entered the shadow of the warehouse, the belt snapped free. I took the heavy metal buckle and began to jam it repeatedly into the narrow gap where the electronic window met the door frame, trying to force the mechanism to short-circuit or break. The driver saw what I was doing in the mirror and hissed a curse, reaching back to try and grab my arm through the small money slot in the partition. I didn't pull away. Instead, I grabbed his hand and bit down on his thumb with every bit of strength in my jaw. He let out a yell of pain and swerved, the car clipping the side of the warehouse entrance with a deafening crunch of metal on brick. The airbag in the driver's side deployed with a loud bang, filling the front cabin with white smoke and dust. The car came to a grinding halt just inside the threshold of the building. I didn't wait for him to recover. I took the metal seatbelt buckle and smashed it against the side window over and over until the glass finally gave way and exploded outward. I scrambled through the broken window just as 2 men in dark coveralls began running toward the car from the back of the warehouse. I didn't look for a door. I ran toward the rising bay door that hadn't finished closing yet. I slid under the bottom edge of the rolling metal gate just as it hit the floor, the heavy steel brushing against my heels as I cleared the gap. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, my lungs screaming for air and my clothes soaked with a mix of rain and sweat. I flagged down a passing truck driver, who saw the blood on my hands and the look of pure terror on my face and immediately called the police. When the authorities raided the warehouse an hour later, it was completely empty. The silver car was gone, the men were gone, and there was no trace that anyone had ever been there, except for a single piece of my torn jacket caught on the edge of the bay door. To this day, I don't know who they thought I was or what they wanted with me, but I know that I was never supposed to leave that building alive. I moved to a different state a week later, but every time I see a yellow cab idling at a street corner, I feel that same cold hand grip my heart, and I keep walking until my legs go numb. The city was unusually quiet for a Tuesday night, the kind of silence that feels heavy and expectant, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath. I had just finished a late dinner with some old friends and decided to hail a cab instead of walking the 6 blocks to my apartment, a decision I would come to regret before we even reached the first intersection. A dark, nondescript sedan with a weathered taxi light on the roof pulled up to the curb, and the driver, a man with a deeply lined face and eyes that seemed to wander, gestured for me to get in. I sat in the back behind the passenger seat, resting my head against the cool glass of the window and watching the streetlights flicker past like rhythmic pulses of light. The driver was playing a recording of someone speaking in a language I didn't recognize, a low, repetitive chanting that was barely audible over the hum of the engine. I tried to ignore it, pulling my phone out to check my emails, but a strange sensation at my feet made me freeze in place. It was a soft, intentional brush against my left ankle, something that felt like the fabric of a sleeve or perhaps a gloved hand. At first, I thought I had just kicked a floor mat or a piece of trash, so I pulled my feet back and tucked them under the seat. But then, a few seconds later, I felt it again, a firm, cold pressure around the back of my heel, as if someone were measuring the size of my foot. My heart stopped for a beat, and I slowly looked down into the dark footwell, but it was too shadowed to see anything clearly beneath the front passenger seat. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the vibration of the car or a loose wire, but then the car hit a small pothole and the seat in front of me shifted slightly. In the dim light from a passing storefront, I saw a pair of pale, thin fingers retracting into the darkness beneath the seat. There was someone under there. A person was curled up in the narrow, hollow space beneath the front passenger seat, hidden by a long, black fabric flap that hung down to the floorboards. My blood turned to ice as I realized the driver was looking at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes no longer wandering but fixed on me with a terrifying, predatory intensity. He knew I had felt it, and he was waiting to see what I would do next. "Is there something wrong back there?" the driver asked, his voice a low, raspy whisper that sounded like sandpaper on wood. I tried to speak, but my throat was so dry I could only manage a weak cough, and I felt the passenger below move again, this time pressing a heavy weight against the tops of my shoes. I realized with a jolt of horror that the person underneath was trying to grab my laces, perhaps to tie them together so I couldn't run when the car finally stopped. I think I left my wallet at the restaurant. I lied, my voice trembling so much it was a miracle he could understand me. "You need to turn around. I can't pay you unless we go back right now." The driver didn't slow down. Instead, he pressed his foot on the gas, the engine roaring as we blew through a yellow light and headed toward the bridge that led out of the city and into the marshes. "Don't worry about the money," he said, and for the first time he smiled, revealing a row of yellowed, crooked teeth. "The man down there, he already paid for your fare in full." At that moment, I felt a sharp, stinging pain in my calf, and I looked down to see a hand reaching out from under the seat holding a small silver needle. I didn't think. I reacted on pure, raw instinct. I pulled my legs up onto the seat and curled into a ball, screaming at the top of my lungs as I began to kick the back of the front passenger seat with both of my heavy boots. I wasn't just kicking the seat. I was trying to crush the person hiding underneath it. I heard a muffled grunt of pain from below, and the hand with the needle retracted into the shadows. The driver began to swerve, trying to throw me off balance, but I reached out and grabbed the headrest of his seat, pulling myself forward. I took my heavy laptop bag and began to swing it like a flail, smashing it against the side of the driver's head over and over again. He tried to fight me off with one hand while keeping the car on the road, but the chaos inside the small cabin was too much for him to handle. The car veered toward the concrete barrier of the bridge, the tires screaming as they scraped against the edge. I saw my opening when the driver was forced to slam on the brakes to avoid a head-on collision with a concrete pillar. The person under the seat was thrown forward by the momentum, and I heard a sickening crack as they hit the underside of the dashboard. I didn't wait to see if they were getting back up. I didn't even try the door handle, knowing it was likely locked from the front. Instead, I used the heavy metal buckle of my laptop bag strap to smash the side window, the tempered glass exploding into 1,000 tiny shards that rained down onto the pavement. I dove through the window, my shoulder hitting the asphalt hard and sending a jolt of white-hot pain through my arm, but I scrambled to my feet and started running toward the lights of a nearby gas station. I could hear the car door open behind me, and a second person, the passenger from below, crawled out of the vehicle, moving with a strange, limping gait like a broken doll. I reached the gas station and threw myself against the locked glass door, screaming for the attendant to call the police. The man who had been under the seat stopped at the edge of the station's fluorescent lights, his face pale and covered in blood, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. When he heard the distant wail of a police siren, he turned and vanished into the darkness of the marshes, leaving the driver to try and speed away in the battered sedan. The police caught the driver 3 miles down the road, but the man from under the seat was never found. When they searched the car, they found a small, hidden compartment that had been professionally welded into the floorboards, lined with soundproofing foam and fitted with leather restraints. They also found a collection of discarded shoes, all with the laces tied together in complicated nautical knots. I still have nightmares about those pale fingers reaching out from the dark, and every time I sit in a car, I check the floorboards 3 times before I ever let the driver put the car in gear. The rain had stopped, but the city was still dripping, the sound of water echoing in the gutters like 1,000 tiny footsteps following me down the sidewalk. I had been at the office until nearly 2 in the morning, finishing a presentation that was supposed to save my career, but as I stood on the corner of 5th and Main, I felt like I was the only person left in a world made of concrete and shadows. When the black taxi pulled up, its engine idling with a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated in my chest, I felt a wave of relief that I didn't realize was a warning. I opened the door and slid into the back seat, the leather cold and stiff against my legs, and gave the driver my address in the quiet outskirts of the valley. He didn't say a word, which wasn't unusual for a late-night driver, but there was a stillness about him that felt deliberate and heavy. He was a large man, his shoulders filling the width of the driver's seat, and he wore a flat cap pulled low over his eyes, leaving only a sharp, stubbled jawline visible in the dim light of the street lamps. As we pulled away from the curb, I noticed that the meter wasn't running. The small red digital display was dark, and when I mentioned it to him, he simply raised a hand, clad in a thin, black leather glove, and pointed toward a handwritten sign taped to the dashboard. It read, "Flat rate, no meter pay at the end." I settled back into the seat, trying to push down the sudden spike of anxiety that flared in my gut. We were moving through the heart of the city, passing the familiar landmarks of theaters and restaurants, but the driver was taking the corners with a calculated precision that felt more like a patrol than a commute. Every time we passed under a streetlight, the interior of the car would flash with a sickly orange glow, and I would catch a glimpse of the driver's eyes in the mirror. He wasn't looking at the road. He was watching me, his gaze fixed and unblinking, as if he were memorizing the layout of my face. "Is there a reason we're taking the industrial bridge?" I asked, noticing that we had veered away from the main highway that led toward the residential districts. The bridge he was heading toward was an old, rusted structure that was mostly used by freight trucks during the day and was almost entirely abandoned at night. It spanned a wide, sluggish river that was surrounded by miles of salt marshes and crumbling factories. The driver didn't answer. Instead, he reached over and pressed a button on his door panel, and I heard the distinct, heavy thunk of the electronic locks engaging on all 4 doors. "I'd prefer if we stayed on the well-lit roads," I said, my voice coming out thinner and more brittle than I wanted it to be. I reached for my phone, thinking I would call my wife or just check the GPS to see how far off course we were. But as soon as I pulled it from my pocket, the driver slammed his foot on the brake. The car didn't stop, but it lurched violently, and he reached back through the gap in the seats, his gloved hand open and expectant. "The phone," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that seemed to come from his chest rather than his throat. "In this car, there is a silent toll. You pay with your privacy or you pay with your skin. Give it to me, or I stop the car right here on the bridge and we settle this another way." The threat was so blunt and so realistic that my mind went completely blank for a moment. I looked out the window and realized we were already halfway across the bridge. Below us, the black water of the river looked like solid obsidian, and there wasn't another car in sight for miles. I looked at his hand, huge, powerful, and steady, and I realized that if I fought him now, he could simply toss me over the railing and no one would find me for weeks. I placed the phone in his hand, my fingers trembling so much I almost dropped it. He didn't put it in his pocket. He opened his window and tossed it out, the expensive device disappearing into the darkness without a sound. "Now your shoes," he muttered, his eyes back on the road as he accelerated again. "Take them off and put them on the floor in the front." "My shoes? Why would you want my shoes?" I asked, the absurdity of the request clashing with the sheer terror of the situation. "Harder to run in the marsh without shoes," he replied simply. "The mud there is like quicksand. It swallows people who don't know where to step." The realization hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't planning on robbing me and letting me go. He was taking me to the marshes to leave me there, or worse. I began to look around the back seat with a frantic, desperate intensity, my mind racing through every survival movie I had ever seen. The car was impeccably clean. No trash, no tools, nothing that could be used as a weapon. I felt the cold air from his open window blowing back into the cabin, and I realized that we were nearing the end of the bridge. Once we hit the dirt roads of the wetlands, the car would slow down, but the terrain would become my enemy. I started to unlace my shoes, moving slowly to buy myself a few more seconds of thought. Why the marshes? Why me? I realized it didn't matter. The why was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had to create a gap, a moment of chaos that would give me a fighting chance. I looked at the headrest of the driver's seat. It was held in place by 2 steel posts. If I could pull it out, I would have 2 blunt spikes, but I knew from experience that those headrests are designed to stay put during a crash. "Hurry up," the driver growled, his hand reaching back again. I handed him my shoes, one by one, and watched as he threw them into the front footwell on his side. I was now barefoot, trapped in a locked car, with no phone and no way to signal for help. We turned off the paved road at the end of the bridge, the tires crunching onto the gravel and silt of the marshland path. The car began to bounce and sway as we hit the uneven ground, the tall reeds on either side of the road scraping against the doors like skeletal fingers. I noticed something then. The driver was wearing his seatbelt, but he had a seatbelt extender plugged in, likely because of his size. The release button for the extender was sitting right next to the center console, within my reach if I lunged through the gap. If I could release his belt and then cause a sudden movement, he might lose control. But I needed more than just a distraction. I needed a weapon. I felt around the seat cracks one last time, my fingers disappearing into the space where the seat back met the bench. My hand brushed against something cold and thin. I gripped it and pulled. It was a long steel nail file, likely dropped by a previous passenger. It wasn't a knife, but it was made of metal and it was pointed. I gripped it tightly, hiding it against my palm. "We're here," the driver said, bringing the car to a slow crawl. He pulled over into a small clearing surrounded by dense, rotting vegetation. The smell of sulfur and decay was overpowering even through the closed windows. He turned off the engine, and for a moment, the silence was so absolute that I could hear the ticking of the cooling metal under the hood. He began to unbuckle his own seatbelt, his movements slow and confident. He thought he had already broken me. He thought I was just another package to be processed in the dark. As he turned his body to reach for the door handle, I saw the back of his neck, thick, red, and vulnerable. I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound. I lunged forward, not for his neck, but for the gear shift, I slammed the car into neutral and then shoved the nail file into the small ignition slot, twisting it with all my strength. I didn't expect it to start the car, but I hoped it would jam the mechanism. At the same time, I reached over his shoulder and pressed the release button on his seatbelt extender. He roared in anger, a sound that was more animal than human, and swung a massive fist at my head. I ducked, the blow glancing off my ear and sending stars dancing across my vision. But I didn't stop. I grabbed the heavy, metal-encased flashlight he had sitting in the center console and swung it at his face. The heavy glass lens shattered against his forehead, and he slumped back, momentarily dazed. I didn't try to fight him further. I knew he was twice my size and would kill me if he got his hands around my throat. I reached for the driver's side door handle, the only one that wasn't stripped of its internal lever, and shoved him aside to get to it. I tumbled out of the driver's door and onto the muddy ground, the cold silt oozing between my toes. I didn't run into the marsh. I remembered what he said about the quicksand. Instead, I ran back toward the bridge, staying on the gravel path where I could keep my footing. Behind me, I heard the car door slam and the sound of his heavy, stumbling footsteps. He was coming for me, and he knew the terrain better than I did. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, my bare feet being sliced by the sharp gravel and the remnants of discarded shells. I could hear him breathing, a ragged, wet sound that was getting closer. I saw a rusted-out shipping container near the edge of the path and dove behind it, pressing my body into the tall, biting grass. He passed me, his heavy silhouette moving like a ghost in the moonlight. He was holding a long, thin blade that glinted with a dull, silvery light. He stopped only 10 feet away from where I was hiding, tilting his head as if listening for the sound of my heartbeat. "I can smell your fear, little bird," he whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "The marsh always gets its toll. You can't run forever." I waited until he had moved further down the path, and then I did the only thing I could think of. I didn't keep running. I doubled back toward the car. If I could get to the car, I could use it as a weapon or at least find a way to signal for help. I reached the sedan, which was still sitting in the clearing with the driver's door wide open. I scrambled inside, looking for the keys, but he had taken them with him. Then I saw it, the radio. Not a taxi radio, but a high-end CB unit. I grabbed the handset and began screaming into it, "Emergency! I'm at the old industrial bridge marshes. A man is trying to kill me. Please, someone, help me." A voice crackled back immediately, "We hear you. We're tracking the signal now. Stay where you are." But I couldn't stay where I was. The driver had heard me. I saw him running back toward the car, his face twisted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. I grabbed the heavy flashlight, the one I had used to hit him, and waited until he was inches from the door. As he reached in to grab me, I slammed the heavy metal casing into his windpipe with every ounce of strength I had left. He collapsed, clutching his throat and gasping for air, and I didn't wait around. I ran back toward the main road, the adrenaline finally numbing the pain in my feet. 5 minutes later, the headlights of a police cruiser swept over the road, and I fell to my knees, waving my arms like a madman. They found him still crawling near the car, his throat crushed and his forehead split open. They also found my shoes and my phone, but more importantly, they found the toll he had been collecting. Hidden in the spare tire well of the trunk were the IDs and wedding rings of over a dozen people who had disappeared from the city over the last 3 years. The Silent Toll was a nickname the media gave him during the trial, but to me, he was just the man who taught me that sometimes the most dangerous place in the world is the back seat of a car you thought was taking you home. I still walk the 6 blocks from the office now, no matter how late it is or how hard it rains, because I'd rather face the shadows on my own feet than ever be a package again.